In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a realm that spanned continents and centuries, some of the darkest and most disturbing secrets have remained buried beneath the shadow of history. While the empire was renowned for its grandeur, power, and wealth, its private life, particularly behind the closed doors of its palaces, told a vastly different story. Today, we uncover the most horrifying and taboo sexual practices that defined the Ottoman elite. Practices so shocking that they have long been shrouded in secrecy, barely whispered about. What was once hidden behind high walls and silken curtains now demands to be exposed. In this video, we'll take you on a disturbing journey into the forbidden world of the Ottoman Empire's most horrifying and unsettling sex practices. The Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-standing empires in history, was a tapestry woven with complex traditions, power, and untold secrets. As the empire spanned over 600 years, it became a symbol of prosperity, military might, and cultural achievements. However, behind the palatial walls and extravagant lifestyles of the elite, a far darker and more disturbing reality existed, one that remains largely untold in mainstream history. The practices within the harem, the sexual rituals involving power, control, and even exploitation, paint a picture that is far from the gilded image often associated with this great empire. One of the most secretive and notorious aspects of the Ottoman Empire's private life was the harem, a secluded section of the palace where the sultan's wives, concubines, and female slaves lived. For centuries, it was considered a place of luxury and opulence, but for the women who lived there, it was a complex and often harrowing existence. Women were kept as trophies of the sultan's power, their value determined by their beauty, youth, and ability to bear heirs. However, the most horrifying aspects of this environment were the sexual dynamics, which were often rooted in domination, control, and the commodification of the female body. The sultan's unfathomable power. The sultan, the most powerful man in the empire, wielded absolute control over his harem. He was not just a political leader, he was a godlike figure who had the right to do as he pleased with his subjects. The women of the harem were often taken from conquered lands, and their fate was sealed from the moment they entered the sultan's palace. Many of these women were young, sometimes mere children, sold or kidnapped into the sultan's harem, where they were trained in the art of seduction and submission. The sexual power dynamics within the harem were clear. The sultan could choose from his hundreds of women at any time, and no woman had the right to deny him. The women lived in a constant state of anxiety, knowing that they were at the mercy of the sultan's desires. The sexual practices within the harem were not about mutual pleasure, but about power and dominance, with the sultan using his sexual relationships as a tool to maintain control over his empire and his people. The role of eunuchs in the harem. Eunuchs, who were often castrated men, played a significant role in the sexual practices of the Ottoman harem. These men, who were often captured slaves from Africa or the Caucasus, served as the guardians of the harem. However, they were not just there to keep the women confined within the palace walls. They were also responsible for maintaining the sexual integrity of the sultan's concubines. The eunuchs would inspect the women of the harem regularly, ensuring that they remained virgins until they were chosen by the sultan for his pleasure. The power they held over these women was immense, as they were often the ones who decided which women were sent to the sultan's bed. This system of surveillance, in which women's sexuality was controlled and commodified, was deeply ingrained in the fabric of the harem. The eunuchs themselves were often rewarded with power and riches, making them loyal enforcers of the sultan's wishes. The dehumanization of women. Within the harem, the women were not seen as individuals, but as possessions. They were valued only for their beauty, their fertility, and their ability to please the sultan. This dehumanization extended far beyond their role in the sultan's sexual life. Women who failed to bear the sultan's children were often discarded, cast aside in favor of younger, more desirable women. The sultan's concubines and wives were often subject to intense competition, with the most coveted prize being the title of queen consort, a title that could only be earned by producing a male heir. In this intense environment of competition, many of the women resorted to anything within their power to gain favor with the sultan. This often included manipulating the eunuchs, forming alliances with other women, or even engaging in ruthless acts of betrayal. The sexual practices within the harem were not just about physical pleasure, they were about survival. Women who were unable to please the sultan or secure their place within his harem often faced exile or worse, treatment that could easily break them mentally, emotionally, and physically. The sultan's sexual rituals, control through pleasure. It is important to understand that the sultan's sexual practices were not about mutual desire, but about complete control. The sultan's encounters with his concubines and wives were often more ceremonial than sensual, with the ultimate goal of asserting dominance and ensuring loyalty. The sexual rituals were intertwined with the sultan's political strategies. Women who pleased the sultan could be elevated to higher positions within the harem, granted luxurious accommodations, and given access to greater wealth. Those who failed, however, would face the harsh consequences of being forgotten or sent away. The sultan's sexual conquests were often seen as a reflection of his virility and strength. This idea of sexual power was not just about the sultan's personal desires, it was about sending a message to his empire. The sultan was a figure who could not be challenged, and the sexual power he wielded within his palace was an embodiment of his absolute control over both his harem and his empire. As we delve deeper into the dark secrets of the Ottoman Empire's sexual practices, it becomes clear that the relationship between power and sexuality was deeply ingrained in the empire's inner workings. The harem, once seen as a symbol of luxury and beauty, was in fact a prison for many women, a place where they were forced to navigate a treacherous world of competition, manipulation, and sexual exploitation. The sultan's absolute control over these women was a testament to the lengths to which power could go in asserting dominance. In the next part, we will explore the horrifying practices that occurred within the harem and the lasting impact they had on the women who lived there. The Sultan's royal rape. One of the most chilling aspects of the Sultan's sexual control was the concept of royal rape. While the word itself may seem harsh, it is crucial to understand the context within which it existed in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan had absolute power, and his sexual encounters were not based on consent or mutual desire, but on the assertion of dominance. There was no concept of consent in the harem. Everything was dictated by the Sultan's will. The Sultan's sexual rituals were about reaffirming his control over the women, ensuring that they remained in a constant state of submission. If a woman displeased him, her punishment was not just exile or mistreatment. It often involved being subjected to the Sultan's sexual violence, a cruel reminder that her body was not her own, but a mere possession to be used and discarded at his whim. These practices weren't just confined to the Sultan's personal preferences. The societal norms of the time, particularly within the Ottoman court, facilitated this abuse by creating an environment where the sexual exploitation of women was normalized. The women within the harem were not only seen as objects for sexual pleasure, but also as pawns in a game of power that the sultan played with unrelenting authority. The training of concubines, a process of objectification. Concubines were not merely chosen for their beauty, they were subjected to a process of training that molded them into perfect objects of desire for the sultan. The women who entered the harem were often very young and were trained in the art of seduction. They were taught how to please the sultan in ways that ensured his complete domination over them. This training was not about mutual affection or even pleasure for the women. It was about subjugation. The concubines were also subjected to psychological conditioning. where they were taught that their sole purpose was to satisfy the sultan's needs. They were forced to compete against one another, often participating in highly sexualized and degrading activities to gain the sultan's favor. The ultimate prize for these women was becoming the mother of the sultan's child, a position that came with power and influence, but was often a fleeting privilege that could be easily taken away. Many of the concubines' lives were marked by this constant emotional and sexual manipulation. The women who succeeded in earning the sultan's favor were treated with great luxury, but they were never truly free. They were constantly reminded of their status as mere objects for the sultan's use. Even if they bore the sultan's child, their position in the harem was never secure. The sultan's whims could turn against them, and if a woman fell out of favor, she could be cast aside or subjected to the most degrading treatment. The sultan's nightly rituals and their dark meaning. The sultan's nightly sexual rituals were more than just acts of indulgence. They were steeped in dark symbolism and a twisted form of power. These rituals often involved the sultan choosing one or more concubines or wives each night to sleep with. The women were paraded before him, and he would select them based on their appearance, their behavior, or simply his mood. What was most disturbing about these rituals, however, was their cold, calculated nature. They were not about pleasure or intimacy. They were about asserting complete control over the women. These nightly encounters were a public spectacle within the harem. The sultan's selection of a woman was not a private act, but a form of public humiliation for the women involved. Other women would watch, often silently competing for the sultan's attention. The sultan's behavior reinforced the idea that the women were nothing more than his possessions, objects to be admired, coveted, and discarded as he saw fit. The women who were chosen were often paraded in front of the sultan, which symbolized not only their submission to his will, but also their willingness to conform to the rigid expectations placed upon them. It was a nightmarish reality for these women, where their worth was determined by their ability to please a man who viewed them as disposable objects. The exploitation of women in the slave market. While the harem was the epicenter of sexual exploitation in the Ottoman Empire, it wasn't the only place where women were commodified. The empire's slave markets were places where women were bought, sold, and traded as sexual objects. Many of the women who ended up in the sultan's harem were first sold as slaves, often from distant lands like Africa, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. These women were forced into sexual slavery with little to no chance of ever escaping their fate. The slave trade that fueled the harem was a grotesque industry, with young girls and women being sold to the highest bidder. These women were often taken from their families and forced into lives of servitude, first as slaves and then for some as concubines in the sultan's palace. The human trafficking that took place within the empire left thousands of women trapped in a cycle of exploitation, with no means of escaping their circumstances. Even after being chosen to become part of the harem, these women had little power over their own lives. Their bodies were controlled by the sultan and the eunuchs, and their futures were entirely dependent on their ability to please the sultan. The cycle of abuse and exploitation was endless, and for many, there was no way out. The aftermath: psychological and emotional damage. The lasting effects of the Ottoman Empire, as sexual practices on the women of the harem, were profound and often irreversible. Many women suffered from deep psychological trauma as a result of their time spent in the harem. The constant manipulation, sexual abuse, and emotional torment they endured left scars that lasted far beyond their time in the palace. Women who were discarded or exiled from the harem often faced lives of poverty and humiliation. Many were abandoned by their families or forced to live in obscurity. The women who remained in the harem, even those who had children by the sultan, were constantly subjected to the whims of the powerful men who controlled their fate. The emotional and psychological damage caused by these experiences was immense, leaving many women broken, disillusioned, and unable to ever lead normal lives outside the harem. The sexual practices within the Ottoman Empire, harem, were not just acts of indulgence or luxury. They were deeply rooted in a system of domination and control. The women who lived in the harem were subjected to the cruelest forms of exploitation, their bodies reduced to mere objects for the pleasure of the sultan and his courtiers. The harem was a place where power and sexuality were inextricably linked, and the women who lived there were often forced to navigate a world of competition, manipulation, and suffering. Their stories are ones of immense tragedy, and they remind us of the dark realities that often lie hidden behind the glittering facades of empires.